Chiraq, How Poverty Births Violence. Chicago is notorious for three main things: Michael Jordan, deep dish pizza, and high levels of violence. Condescendingly nicknamed Chiraq, the preconceived idea of Chicago being a war zone riddled with death and violence is not entirely unwarranted. Nearly 79% of Chicago residents, when surveyed, reported gun violence as a top concern. The Chicago Department of Public Health has reported that gun related deaths have doubled between 2011 and 2023. Furthermore, the age demographic involved in violent behaviors grows at a concerning rate. 51% of children between the ages of 11 to 14 have reported engaging in violent behaviors such as fights, gang activities, or shootouts at least once. An additional 25% of youth report witnessing a crime on a weekly basis. To make a safer Chicago, it is important to investigate what is driving children and young adults to partake in violent behavior. More often than not, alarming statistics such as these are brushed aside due to belief that minorities in Chicago are simply more violent in nature. Racist biases only work to conceal what is the true root cause of Chicago's violent reputation: poverty. Poverty has historically served as a key predictor of violent rates in a given area. When violence rose in the United States between 1960s and the 1990s, it was the most extreme in areas of concentrated poverty. This fact remains true for Chicago. According to the Illinois Early Childhood Assessment Map, over 42,000 children in Chicago from the ages of 0 to 5 years old live below the poverty line. Additionally, 1 out of every 4 18-year-olds in Chicago lives in poverty. When surveyed, over 70% of Chicago residents cited poverty as a main concern for the safety and development of children in the community. It is not coincidental that both poverty and violence are the top issues plaguing Chicago, as a vicious cycle between the two infects the city's youth. In the paper, Neighborhood Inequality and Violence in Chicago, 1965 to 2020, author Patrick Sharkey explored the topic of correlation between poverty, violence, and youth's mental health, specifically in Chicago. Sharkey's findings found that the persistent spatial distribution of violence is tightly linked to a multitude of factors, one of which being economic status. Low-income residents were exposed to twice as much lethal violence in comparison to their higher-income counterparts. It was also found that these communities had higher policing and incarceration rates, which reduced overall social mobility. When assessing the effect of cognition of youth in Chicago, the findings showed that violence negatively impacted multiple aspects of daily life. Even when youth are not directly harmed, simply living or going to school in violent areas has measurable negative effects on behavior and mental health. When a homicide occurs near a child's home shortly before a cognitive assessment, the child performs significantly worse on tests of attention, impulse control, and learning. As effects appear immediately, this suggests that violence induces stress responses that temporarily impair cognition, providing evidence that even a single violent incident can disrupt children's cognitive functioning. Violence can greatly change young people's behavior and social networks. Youth in high violence areas may alter their routines and form protective friendship with older peers for safety. Additionally, violence shapes development in child-centered spaces, such as parks, playgrounds, and schools. Moreover, aspects such as sleep are impacted and add to cognitive dysfunctioning. On nights following nearby violent crime, children experience shorter sleep duration, lower sleep efficacy, and elevated stress hormone levels. Increased stress and sleep dysfunction caused by violent environments ultimately led to trouble concentrating, learning, and self-regulation. Dysregulation of youth's mental well-being can further manifest itself as poor academic records. Violence especially depresses test scores for Black and low-income students. Moreover, the gap in academic performances due to a violent environment's impact on mental health has extreme repercussions that have lasting effects into adulthood. Children who grew up in neighborhoods with higher violent crime rates have lower earnings and generally lower rates of upward social mobility in adulthood. This is primarily due to the fact that violence can affect adult outcomes through disrupted schooling, chronic stress, and cognitive strain. Ultimately, these setbacks accumulate to have intergenerational impacts, as it is more difficult to escape poverty and therefore escape the violence. Violence can dictate and completely overturn an individual's physical well being. For instance, excess cortisol secretion resulting from fear of violent crime, impaired glucose metabolism, abdominal fat deposition resulting in an increased likelihood of obesity. Social ophthalmologist Elizabeth L. Tung, MD, in 2019 spoke on the effects that she witnesses violence having on her patients' health. They would be hesitant to join walking groups because they were afraid to walk in their neighborhoods. Or I'd ask, "Why didn't you get your medication on time?" And they'd say, "Well, I could only get a ride at night, and I don't want to leave the house at night." That kind of thing was coming up a lot more. The violence a person experienced in their own community, the lonelier they were likely to be, increasing social isolation and loneliness. These two factors, while at first seeming entirely mental in nature, have been associated with limited physical activity, not taking medication properly, poor nutrition, binge drinking, and smoking. Furthermore, hypervigilance, best defined as a heightened emotional state of well being or always feeling on guard, can often act as a barrier for making healthy lifestyle choices. Exposure to different types of violence can increase hypervigilance scores for a given area. When exposed to community violence, participants' hypervigilance score increased by 5.5%. An important note found within the research as well is that hypervigilance scores increase more, nearly 9.8%, with participants witnessing police violence and police stops being associated with a 20% increase in hypervigilance scores. Often, hypervigilance can manifest as hypertension, leading to cardiovascular diseases and memory impairment. Additionally, the findings serve as evidence of distrust that the community has for law enforcement, which undoubtedly leads to further self-isolation. Combination of loneliness and hypervigilance can prove to be especially worrisome for older patients, as loneliness and social isolation have been linked to higher risk for cardiovascular diseases. While many argue that the only ones who are being harmed by violence are those committing and victims of the act, other sources negate this claim. American physician Monica E. Peake notes, "Violence impacts more than just the victims, but the whole community. Everyone's health is potentially affected." All hope is lost. Chicago is many things, including a city full of resilient and united people. It is full of people who love, cry, and fight for one another. Countless programs have been founded in recent years to help address issues of poverty and violence in the city. One such program, Metropolitan Family Services, is a nonprofit based in Chicago, which seeks to help families in poverty and provide aid in the forms of mental health services, employment assistance, legal aid, violence intervention, and violence protection. In 2024 alone, they were able to make contact and provide assistance to 167,443 individuals, with the majority being children and young adults. In 2023, 211 Metro Chicago was launched. It serves as a free 24/7, 365 service that connects all Cook County residents to essential health and social service support and information. Chicago Public Libraries have begun to introduce free mental health and social services to children, as well as offer a safe space for children to reside. Creed, an organization that believes the individuals most at risk are not the problem, they are the solution, has created multiple programs aimed at creating a safer, better Chicago. Beginning in 2021, Creed's youth program helps connect young participants to older volunteers, which help in coaching, therapy, and education. Creed also directly addresses the trauma that the city's violence causes on the youth through their Addressing Violence Building Skills program. Participants are able to learn a wide set of skills, from financial literacy to stress management, all while receiving as needed services such as therapy and drug counseling. Furthermore, systematic changes are taking place as the nuances of poverty are beginning to be understood. In Chicago, the healthcare system is changing and evolving. We're starting to think not just about medical care, but the social needs of our patients, and trying to use medical systems as a way to integrate those needs. Having more holistic approach will better help our health outcomes. When looking at news headlines and homicide reports, it may seem as though Chicago is a city beyond repair. Let it be known this is not the case. Chicago, a city once burned to the ground, was rebuilt and made beautiful through the love that its residents have for their home. Today, this truth holds the same as citizens refuse to stand aside and continue to fight for a change. For decades, the young people of Chicago have been subjugated to a multi generational, vicious cycle of poverty and violence, leading to poor mental and physical health. Chicago is violent now, but this does not always have to be the case. It is vital that action is taken in order to protect each new generation so that the city can properly grow and heal. The fate of Chicago is ultimately in the hands of its citizens. Through the founding of multiple community outreach and support programs, they have proven repeatedly that Chicago is a city worth fighting for. For the past decade, the people of Chicago have been uniting to put an end to the violence which haunts them. The efforts of ordinary citizens, motivated by the love they have for their city and fellow man, have shifted the narrative. Now, Chicago begins to take its steps into a brighter, freer future. On to the pressing question: why should people care? Why should someone from any of the other 49 states, or even the rest of Illinois, why should the U.S. care about Chicago? Simply put, the problems facing Chicago are not unique. Instead, they are a reflection of a national crisis. Poverty is rising across the United States, with child poverty specifically having nearly tripled between 2021 and 2024. America's long-standing struggle with gun violence continues to worsen. In 2024 alone, there were 336 incidents of gun violence in grades K through 12 nationwide. Chicago has historically been portrayed as the epicenter of the intersection between poverty and violence. But change is happening. As of August 2025, homicides have decreased by 32%, shootings by 37%, and an overall crime reduction of 22% compared to 2024. These statistics not only challenge the narrative that Chicago is beyond repair, but speaks to what can be done nationwide. If Chicago, Chiraq, the city so often mocked for its supposed cruelty, can begin to heal and make measurable progress, it offers hope. Hope for cities and communities across the nation facing the same intertwined struggles. Hope that one's fellow man can care enough to make a difference. Hope that the nation begins to realize one simple truth: people matter.